Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Future Leader Sessions. This is one of my favorite sessions to be doing because today we're going to be having two amazing leaders on the screen that are going to be talking all about interviews, which I know for a lot of you, and even for me, is sometimes one of the most nerve-wracking parts of a hiring process. So we're going to be really digging in and learning what they like, the experiences that they've had, where they've gone wrong, and also hopefully some tips and tricks for everybody in here, both as hiring managers and if you're looking for a new job yourself. So I'm just going to give a couple of seconds to let everybody join the room. I can see we've got people with us live on LinkedIn. So welcome if you're live on LinkedIn, and also welcome if you're joining us here in the Zoom room, where we are going to be talking and interacting everything to do with interview specials. I'm really excited as well to have both John Kilmartin and Darla Harper joining me today to be talking about this topic. And in just a second, they are going to be introducing themselves. But before we go there, I want to take a few minutes just to go through some basic housekeeping and explain to you how this session is going to run. This is session 8, would you believe it, of Future Leaders. I actually can't believe we've done so many and now we're on number 8. But if you're new to this, that's great because there's 7 episodes that you can watch on the Elemed website, which will be receiving a link to at the end of the session. So there's loads of content on there for you to be following. But let me explain how this is going to work. This is a 90-minute session. And in the 90 minutes, we are going to be talking through some pre-registered questions, and we're going to give the opportunity for you guys listening live to interact and ask your questions to our amazing panel. In terms of what you need to know when it comes to housekeeping, we're multitasking right now, guys. So we're running both a Zoom and a LinkedIn Live format. And we have hundreds of you joining on LinkedIn Live, according to the most recent numbers that I've got from my marketing teams. And we have people sitting here in the Zoom room. So welcome. We are going to be running Q&A via Slido. So in just a second, I'm going to be skipping to another QR code on the screen. So get your phones ready. As soon as I put that QR code, scan it because it will give you the opportunity to open up Slido, which is where you're going to be able to interact with us all over. You're going to be able to ask your questions and you're going to be able to upvote. So if you have a burning question that you want to make sure we get it in front of our panel, add it into the Slido. If equally you've just joined this and you just want to listen in, have a scroll through the questions that are already there and the questions that others are putting in, because you will have the opportunity to upvote those questions. By upvoting those questions, you're letting us know these are the questions that we should be asking first. And we will be going through the questions in the Q&A section in priority order based on how many votes. So we want you to be interactive and we want you to be upvoting and letting us know what questions you want us to put to the panel. We are recording this. And so if you have to drop off, don't worry, you will find the recording on the Elemed website. But the real value of these sessions is in the interaction and the ability to ask your questions to the panel. So stay on for the full 90 minutes in order to get maximum value. We will not overrun. We will be on time, and we love feedback here at Elemed. So please keep an eye on your inboxes to be able to share with us your feedback on how this session has run and what we can do to improve, as well as ideas and suggestions for our next sessions that are coming up in 2025. Okay, so get your phones ready. I'm about to bring the QR code onto the screen for Slido. Here we go. So if you scan this QR code, you'll be able to open up Slido. And from there, you will be able to see the questions that are already in there. And that's the place where you're going to be able to ask some new questions. Now, if you are on LinkedIn, please make sure you're interacting via Slido, because we do not have anybody monitoring the LinkedIn page. If you're in Zoom and you have tech issues, feel free to message directly in the Zoom chat. And Jess will be on hand to help you with any technical issues that you might be having today. But hopefully it's all going to be running smoothly, because now, as I say, we are now on episode 8. So hopefully we are all pros at this by now. Let's have a go at interacting with Slido. You should be seeing a poll coming up on your screen to ask where you are joining from. And I'd love to know where in the world you are based right now and where you'd be joining us from. So if you keep an eye on your Slido at any second, a poll should be appearing. to ask you this question and just to make sure that Slido is working. So let's have a look. Let's have a look. Where are you based? What are people saying? So we've got somebody in the UK. We've got Paris. Very nice. France. One of my favorite countries, I have to say. If I didn't live in London, I would love to live in Paris. Honestly, it's one of my favorite cities. We've got Switzerland. We've even got California. So hello if you're in California, and thank you for joining us this early in the morning for you. We've got Belgium. We've got Scotland, also a beautiful place. We've got Basel. We've got Germany. We've got Ireland. We've got people from all over the world. So welcome, and we really hope that you're going to be enjoying this session. So without further ado, I'm going to just take a second to bring up onto my screen both Darla and John, who will now take a second to introduce themselves, and we're going to jump straight into the conversation. So Darla, over to you. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Darla Harper, originally from the US, now living in Switzerland. I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs for Consumables at BD. And I've been in regulatory affairs for roughly 20 years. I'm kind of dating myself there. And when it comes to interviews, really, just to give you a bit of a flavor of what I look for as a hiring manager is I'm looking for the right cultural fit. I'm looking for the person who's really going to add some value and really, collaborate and communicate with cross-functional teams. The regulatory stuff will come, but that's the most important bit for me.
Thank you, Darla. John, over to you.
Hi, Elena. Yeah, delighted to be here. John Kilmartin is my name. And so I currently work as a global regulatory advisor in consultancy work. And I also work as an adjunct professor at the University of Galway and with Trinity, involved in clinical trials and also educating the next generation of particularly regulatory affairs professionals. So like Darla, I'm based in Ireland, in Europe, but spent a lot of my career working with Medtronic. So up until a year ago, I was the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs with Medtronic, with a coronary and renal denervation division there. So yeah, very passionate in relation to this topic. Elena, so delighted to contribute. The person, I think you'll hear a lot today about the right cultural fit, looking at diversity. And then for me, probably one of the things that you hear a lot about is empathy. I often controversially say that regulatory affairs is easy, but relationships are hard. So ideally, the empathy factor is big for me, Elena. So hopefully that will come through in today's conversation. Look forward to it.
Thank you both for joining. And like I say, we really wanted to do a deep dive on interviews here at Elemed. Obviously, as you know, we specialize in recruitment and talent management in the MedTech industry. But interviews are really the place where you can really have a big impact. And what we see often are that candidates going into interviews really prepare, right? So you're going in to interview for a new job. You're going to make sure you're sussing out your elevator pitch. You're going to make sure you've done your research on the company. You're going to make sure you know what value you add and how you match the requirements of the job description. But actually, where we see sometimes let's say a little bit lacking, actually hiring managers having done that prep on their side as well, and actually thinking, okay, how am I going to impress this candidate? And actually putting a bit of structure in place when it comes to thinking about what does good look like? How am I going to make sure I'm not biased in the way that I'm asking the questions? How am I going to ensure consistency through my process? And so what we wanted to do here was, from two hiring managers that are actively doing it right now and have been there and done that for many, many years, is take your learnings and share them so that people that are listening can actually say, hey, am I doing that? And actually, should I be doing that? So no, thank you both for joining. So I guess my first question is, and Darla, you already sort of touched on this. What does a good interview look and feel like for you as a hiring manager? So, John, let me start with you.
So in relation, what does a good interview look like? Yeah. So, so for me, I think if it's designing the interview, I think first of all to suit the role. And for me, I think probably the first thing is kind of looking at, am I looking here at an individual contributor role, or is it a people manager who's going to be supervising, staff, etc. In terms of the structure, typically the HR partner will help us to, design the basic structure, etc. Typically, I would also look for, the role of other functions. No one acts, as an island. So think really important to have other functions. Maybe part of it's a longer interview, process. And and I think then probably the other thing in terms of designing, the interview as well, what I would say is finding something small at the beginning to help the interviewee to relax. So that can be just a general conversation early on, and getting them to speak through their CV in their own words first of all. So that's some of the kind of the early designing of the interview process that I would think about, Elena.
Darla, let me jump to you when it comes to the design. So how do you design your interview processes?
So I actually, similar to John, I do look at, like, what am I hiring for? Am I hiring for an individual contributor? Am I hiring for, a team leader or somebody more senior, right? Because those skill sets are very different. And of course, I pitch the questions towards that skill set. For example, if you have a team that's maybe disjointed or they're not pulling together and you're hiring a senior leader, you want to make sure that they have and I'll go back to what John said, empathy, right? Are they going to be able to connect with the team members and to start asking questions that are a little bit more open, a little bit more leading around people and dynamics and what it is you're expecting from them? If you're hiring an individual contributor, it's more about, how do you work with other partners? How do you partner across the business to drive a project forward or to get a submission in and ask open, leading questions? You don't want just a yes or a no answer. You want them to provide a bit. And one thing I can say to people who are hiring managers, because I've seen this as an interviewee, is make sure you read their CV before you get on the call, right? Make sure that you actually know who's coming to step in front of you so that you can actually show that you're interested in them as a person. Because you have to remember, you're selling yourself as well. You're selling the company as well. They need to want to work for you too.
Yeah, and also I find that just the quality of the conversation, if you've already planned what you're going to say and you've identified what the structure is going to look like, and you've read the CV, the quality of the conversation that then ensues is better than just the surface level kind of basics that would otherwise happen. I really want to dig more down into the design of the interview though. So you've both touched on some really interesting points about adapting the design of the interview to whether it's an individual contributor versus a leader. John, you spoke about, bringing in partners, which is something that we're seeing much more nowadays, actually partners having a bigger role. So, business partners or, other departments, for example, having a much bigger role in the interview process and having a say as well as to whether that person actually gets hired. So let's drill down a little bit more. So how will that look? So in your experience, what are the differences in the design when it comes to single contributor versus leadership? John, I'm going to point that to you first.
Yeah, I think a lot of the fundamentals, are the same. So initially, I kind of jotted down before we came on here, Elena, just what are the things that in any interview, regardless of whether it's individual contributor, or a people manager, and for me there are four things. So one is we've all seen that famous Barack Obama video on getting stuff done, and his view in terms of people that you can assign something to, regardless of how small the task is, and they will come back with a really good job done. That's the first thing. Number two then is fit, and the cultural fit, diversity fit. That's probably the most important thing. After every interview, it's the one thing, particularly if there's a panel, how do you think they would fit within the department or the function? The third thing is what I would call the likability factor. And it's really, is this somebody I can work with on a day-to-day basis, week-to-week basis, whether that's remotely, or in person. And then finally, I think the last thing then is the empathy, the empathy piece. So they're the four things that if I were to distill it down in terms of what I'm looking for, regardless of whether it's individual contributor or people manager, obviously then, you will uptick on those to a certain degree. The empathy piece, the fit piece will be, very important for the people manager in terms of managing up and down an organization. And for the individual contributor, I think that whole mindset of, evidence of getting stuff done. And that doesn't have to be a big project. Sometimes when people come in interviews, they will tell you how many 510Ks or PMAs that they've filed. But, what I'm looking for is kind of examples of continuous improvement, examples of, areas where they've, moved the needle in terms of, processes that they've been involved in. So in general, but I would say in conclusion, I would say the basic principles are the same, but I think you dial them up or dial them down depending on whether they're an individual contributor or a people manager.
Mm-hmm. Darla, do you have anything to add to that?
I just say that I definitely agree. And like one thing that I actually look for, which might be just my own background coming through, is I ask a lot of questions around how do you navigate change? How do you navigate ambiguity? How do you help get teams over the line when things aren't completely clear or when the business isn't clear? Like, how do you drive that forward and give me examples? Because I find that, especially in regulatory and quality, we're also dealing a lot with ambiguity. We live a lot in gray, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to make sure that the person that I'm bringing into my team is comfortable with the gray, because that's a place that we live in this industry. So.
And if you're listening, everybody, I hope you were scribbling down those questions. And if not, don't worry, because this session has been recorded and you can always refer back. But those are some really, really good questions. And that's to your point, Darla, it's about asking open questions as well. That will encourage the candidate to bring examples and actually to talk through examples from their experience. So I want to ask a question around interview stages. What would you say? What are your thoughts? What is the sweet spot in terms of how many stages to an interview should there be?
Ooh, that's a hard one. I'll go first. I think any more than 3 is probably too much, because I think candidates start to switch off.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you need to have several people involved in the interview process, to John's point earlier, around, functional partners or stakeholders that are important to that role. But any more than 3 and people start getting kind of that, oh God, here we go, for everybody, both the interviewer and the interviewee.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think maybe, to add to that, obviously it very much depends. You can often sometimes sense if someone is, nervous or starting to relax or kind of to, get into more of a conversation mode, as Darla said, there earlier. So sometimes towards the end of an interview, at the beginning of an interview, I think it's human nature, we often tend to form an opinion very quickly, and I think the most important thing then is to be open to change. And I've often found that sometimes, whether it's a conversation or whether it's a formal interview, you start learning something, towards the end of the conversation, and that kind of opens it up. So I would often like to kind of leave it somewhat open-ended to say, hey, if we needed to come back and just have a follow-up conversation, we'd like to do it. But I'd agree with Darla. Once it goes beyond 3, it starts to get a little bit tedious for the interview and the interviewer. But I think it's also important to be respectful. Sometimes interviews may not go well, and I know we may speak to that, later, Elena. But it's still also important to be respectful. They've taken the time to, to share their experiences with you. So 3 is probably a good number, Darla.
And on structure then, how would you, so we spoke about the process, so like some roughly 3 stages, we're saying is probably the sweet spot. And then what stakeholders would you involve, if any, John?
Yeah, so in my function typically, which was regulatory affairs, typically the functions that you would engage, particularly for a more senior position, would be primarily those functions they're going to interface with. So if they're in the post-market phase of regulatory affairs, then meeting with quality manufacturing operations is key. If they're in the pre-market phase of submissions, then obviously meeting with the design and R&D team is really important. And then also one of the things that we all know, that to be, for example, in our function in regulatory affairs, you don't want to be the compliance kind of policing type department. So, really important to have all of those functions that maybe will form that impression of you, have all of them engage with you and realize that will also include the marketing teams. I think it's a really good sanity check if the marketing function and the R&D function are coming back and saying, hey, person A is a good, a good team player. They're helping us out. They're coming up with solutions rather than putting all the reasons, why we can't make that change or can't say that in our claims, etc. So those functions would jump out, particularly for regulatory, marketing, R&D, operations, and quality. Clinical, may be important also.
So obviously a lot of functions that you just mentioned there. So what I would love to know though is like what are your thoughts on the work that you need to put in on the back end? Because what I see very often is that hiring managers will say, hey, we should just bring that business unit leader in to interview the candidate. Almost, first of all, it's almost like an afterthought. So it hasn't really been very well planned. But then where I've seen companies go wrong is they haven't actually prepped that individual that's going to be interviewing that candidate. So it's almost like the business unit leader is interviewing based on their own interpretation of what good looks like, and they didn't necessarily ask the questions that the hiring manager wanted them to ask. Maybe the candidates come out of the interview with like a whole new nugget of information that actually had never ever been discussed. And actually, by bringing these partners in, I believe that in order for that to be done successfully, there needs to be some sort of prep, some sort of heads up or interaction on like what you want them to be doing, what you want them to be looking at. Do either of you have any tips or tricks when it comes to involving business partners or stakeholders in your interview processes?
Another good question. So I find a lot that I really value the input personally of R&D, because I find sometimes, well, R&D and marketing are like my two key ones usually, because I find from my experience in regulatory, we're the ones that are often at loggerheads with, right, with marketing and R&D, because they always want us to either go faster or do more, right? So I always ask those guys to kind of come in and say, give them a scenario that you've seen in our business that what you want regulatory support on, and let's see how they answer it. Like, don't make it super complicated. That's not fair. But give them a scenario to see what they would say they'd react to. Like, would they be collaborative? Would they be more, conservative? And then kind of set that into our business. Are we more risk averse? Are we more, risk free? Like, where do we sit? And then kind of get that and understand where they are and then feed that back to us. But that's generally what I try and get them to do, because I don't want to give them too much, but I want to give them something to kind of guide them, because I also want them to get what they need, because they're going to be a stakeholder at the end of the day.
Yeah. And maybe, Ellen, I'd agree, Darla. And I think maybe to add to that, I would say, two things. I think it also depends on the leader. So if I take, and then I'm sure they won't mind me mentioning their names, two of my former bosses in Medtronic, one was a regulatory leader. Geraldine Fincher was a fantastic boss. But I think she also had a kind of a mantra about, every individual should outgrow their current role, no matter where they are in the organization, whether they're the individual that's kind of looking at the very first, simple change orders, or whether they're developing the regulatory and clinical strategy for the, the highest profile product in the portfolio. So I think that's one thing. And then Jason Weidman, who was a business leader that I worked for, was fantastic. And his view of, for example, the function regulatory is, John, I expect you guys to do the functional stuff well, but what I'm really looking for is, what do you bring to the business as a business partner? So if in those circumstances, if either of those individuals were interviewing somebody senior in a group that I was hiring for, I would probably give those individuals a heads up, on that this is what they value. I think that might, be fair for them. And I think the other thing I would probably consider, Elena, and it goes to what Darla mentioned there, is not trying to catch them out, but asking a leading question. And we talked earlier there about empathy, and you never truly know another person until you walk in their shoes. So that leading question, for example, maybe, hey, if it's a manufacturing operations, person or whatever, saying, hey, manufacturing make loads of changes. How do you react to a manufacturing engineer constantly coming up to you, trying to get these change orders through? And rather than the reaction saying, hey, I wish they would make less changes, you're looking for the reaction there to say, hey, how can I help him or her understand that that's a particular type of submission or whatever? So I think you may be asking a challenging question for them, but you're just looking for the reaction. Is it more empathetic, or is it, hey, I'm a busy function, please leave me alone? So which isn't what you want to hear.
Yeah. And I really like that. So actually taking case studies, but you know, things that you've seen before, and putting them in front of the candidate and saying, if you were faced with this, like, how would you deal with that? And looking for examples that would, you know, give you an inkling of how they might handle situations that you've seen before. And actually prepping your stakeholders and prepping the candidate as well, what you said, John. So prep the candidate on, hey, this is who you're going to be speaking to, and this is as a heads up, this is what I can tell you about them. But also equally on the other side, prepping the stakeholders themselves on, hey, these are the things I'd like you to ask to the candidate. These are the things I'd like you to explore, so that you're keeping that communication going, and you're keeping it focused on what you want to see it focused on. How much, one final question on structure, and then we'll go into failures. And I'm really excited to look at that bit. But one more question on structure. Do you plan, or do you actually spend time thinking about what you want to see in the answer? So what a good answer actually looks like?
I do.
Okay.
I do, because
how do you go about doing that?
So I guess it's kind of, I kind of put myself in the mind of whatever business I'm currently in at the time. Like, what is it we're struggling with, and what is it that we're succeeding at, and where do things fit? So when I start asking the leading questions, the open questions, to kind of go, let's see how they're going to perform. Let's see, you know, to John's point, are they empathetic? Are they, oh, please leave me alone? You know, for certain questions, it'll be, I want to hear that they are problem solving. I want to see that they are thinking more broadly, that they're thinking globally, or that maybe it's a US issue, so they're thinking about the US. Like, I want to hear that more broad, almost in a way, soft skills of how do they interact with people? How are they going to succeed? Where do I see any red flags? We can get to that later, you know, and it's kind of, I have an idea in my head what I want for each question, and I kind of jot it down to myself before I go into the interview. And if anybody on here has ever interviewed with me, they'll probably remember that they'll see me looking down and checking, like, I'm actually check mark, and I'll do like a check mark, yes, they got there, or no, they didn't. And so I have something I can look at that's very quick. So I can go back and say they met that or they didn't. So that's kind of a little bit of what I do.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm probably a little bit different on that one, insofar as, you know, I probably wouldn't, I would try to train myself not to have the you know, the preconceived, the answer that my bias would bring me to, but more so, what process did they work through to get to that answer? So I would often find myself asking the same questions, like you did there earlier, Darla, you know, where you mentioned about, you know, the functions that they need to really partner with, like, you know, R&D or marketing, you know, or operations. So I think presenting them with a scenario where you almost lead them to say, hey, I wish manufacturing would make less changes, or I wish R&D, you know, that design change, that they had, you know, adequate verification data for it, or the marketing team, you know, we kind of saying, I wonder why are they pushing the boundaries in that scope. So what you're really looking for is the realization that marketing are doing their job, operations are doing their job, R&D are doing their job. You know, your role now is to facilitate that. So I think particularly in functions like regulatory affairs, I think you need, you know, you're looking for not necessarily the stock perfect answer, but what thought process did they work through, you know, and are they being helpful, or are they automatically, you know, defaulting to a hindrance? So that helps a little bit, Elena.
And just to also put out there as well, I think on the Elemed website, if it's not there, it will be there, hopefully. But we do have a tool, which is an interview scorecard. So it's actually taking what both of you have said and formalizing it a little bit more, where you can actually go in preparation for your it is there. So the link will be included in the follow-ups. So you can actually go in and say, right, these are the questions that I want to make sure I'm asking everybody, because it's about that consistency of asking the same questions as well. And then being able to jot down what for you is a good answer. So whether it's, you know, about the process that they're going through to get to that answer, and what will you want to see them hit in the process itself, or actually what the end answer actually looks like, you're able to actually do that. And then what you can do is have that for each of your candidates, and it will allow you to kind of more objectively, rather than just going, okay, gut feel, because we all like people that we're more similar to naturally, and that's the inherent bias as well. We can actually look at objectively at their answers versus what we're asking, and actually put a little bit more science behind that. So that will be available to download from the Elemed website. We'll be getting the link in the chat, and it will be in the follow-up email as well for anyone who's got some interviews upcoming. That's a really, really good tool. And we use that here at Elemed as well, even. So Please make use of that. Right, I'm going to give you both 10 seconds breather because we're going to get into failures, and I'd love to know, well, let's call them lessons learned from interview processes. But before we go there, I'm going to just take a second to screen share again the QR code. So if you're late to join the session, you'll see a QR code on the screen. Grab it, scan it with your phone. It will take you to Slido. In the second half of the session, we're going to be going through some live Q&A. So once you've scanned this QR code, you will be able to go into Slido. If you've got a burning question that you want to make sure that we're asking to our panel, you can write it down there. Or if you're just curious, have a scan through the questions that are already there and give it a thumbs up to upvote the question that you want us to ask. When we come to the live Q&A section, I will be asking the most popular questions first. So keep an eye on that Slido and keep giving the thumbs up to the questions that you want answers to make sure that we are addressing the points that you want us to address in this session. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now and let's go back to the conversation where now we're going to be talking about biggest interview fails and lessons learned. Darla, what can you tell me?
Oh, wow. Interview fails. I once had one where one of the things I will say to people, please check your technology. We had a big storm once and I was working from home, had an interview. I couldn't connect. The other person couldn't connect because they were also in the UK in a big storm. And so please check or reschedule, or if you see something like that, that's one fail that is so easily avoidable. And the other that I had, which is really weird, it was really early on in my career, I was brand new to management, is my HR partner actually scheduled an interview with me with somebody who didn't speak English. And so we had to kind of rapidly find someone who could translate Chinese or Mandarin. And so that was one of the most really awkward interviews I've ever had. I mean, kudos to the person I was interviewing. They just stuck in there and they just answered as best they could and waited for the translator. We ended up hiring them.
Oh, wow. So it worked out in the end.
It worked out in the end after we got to the third stage interview and we were better prepared. But that was a big fail. That could have gone so wrong and it could have made us look really bad as a company. But we managed to kind of suck it up and recover. But yeah, always make sure that everyone speaks the same language at some point. I know that sounds like a kind of oh yeah, but it was one that really surprised me at the beginning of my career. So I always check now.
Yeah.
You don't think about checking, but I always check now.
For sure. And tech stack, especially because so many interviews now are virtual and, do you have that good stable internet connection and making sure that actually that's all well up and running before the interview actually starts. That's a good tip. John, what about you?
Yeah, from a practical perspective, I don't have any nice ones like that, Darla, other than maybe turning up on the wrong day. And obviously that's unfortunate if it's the day after rather than the day before. So that was a once off, thankfully. No, I would say, though, obviously, from an interview fails perspective, and we'll see it later in terms of, what were good interviews, obviously, what really stands out if you yourself as the interviewer are unprepared, it does show. And I think, as I said earlier, just the respect to be given. Sometimes it can become obvious during an interview that the interviewee is out of their depth, or they realize and you realize that, hey, this just isn't, the right fit. And that can happen, and it's awkward, and we'll see some of that in Slido, I'm sure, later. Where or individuals may be kind of shy or nervous or whatever. So I think, for me, it's kind of teeing yourself up to say, right, be prepared because we're asking the interviewee to be prepared, and we say that the small stuff matters. So I think, we owe that to do that ourselves. But then also what I would say is just being respectful. If the interview isn't going well, then you kind of find a mechanism by which there's a graceful exit for the interviewee as well, because they've put the time into it. Maybe it just didn't work out, some misunderstanding somewhere along the line. So, but yeah, no huge ones, Elena, that I would go back and maybe admit to.
So okay, let's go then on the flip side. So like best interviews that you've had that stand out. John, why don't you start with that one then?
Yeah. So I think, I often love quotations, and someone once, said to me, what's meant for you won't pass you. So in other words, if the right job, is there, it will eventually, come your way. You just need to kind of explore it and come and find it. And, I think, in terms of best interviews ever, I couldn't think of one. I think there are three that stand out, and sometimes they stand out simply because of the person. So one interview very early, relatively early in my career as a manager, but also in the individual who was a young associate specialist at the time. He had returned, a Dutch guy. He'd returned from Japan. His wife was Irish. Looking for a technical role using his language skills, in the west of Ireland, and he thought, how am I going to get a job with all of these competencies? And there was an ad in the local media, and he came on the call and just so delighted that suddenly he had found, a fit. He could use his technical skills. He absolutely loved Japanese, and we had a need at the time for, interactions with our regulatory teams, with our Japan counterparts. So it's fantastic when you have a cultural fit, you have a nuanced role like that, and it works out well. So that's one example. A second example in terms of a best interview was where and many people will this will resonate with them, where you end up with two fantastic candidates and you just cannot make up your mind. And we have used, Elena, independent industrial psychometric testing where they're not making a judgment on the individual, but they're really, really helpful in terms of what type of function would they be a good fit in. So they basically, luckily we were interviewing for roles in R&D and in regulatory at the time, and the industrial psychometric testing helped us to actually, the feedback from that said, hey, person A is going to be fantastic in regulatory. They have all of the following competencies inherently, and candidate B, is a great fit for the R&D function. So that was a real learning, for ourselves, because you do agonize over that, for there's really good people. And then the third example that I thought about was we were interviewing for a really senior role in quality, and I was one of the other cross-functional functions brought in, so it wasn't for my own function. And the particular person probably didn't meet the kind of the spec requirements in terms of pre-market regulatory or quality, but were fantastic on the post-market quality. And I think that the business leaders all were willing to adjust and say, okay, well, this person doesn't have the pre-market prerequisites, and it was a pretty senior role, but their post-market experience and just the way they do their work trumps it. So it's fantastic to see that person, getting a role. We didn't let the definition of the spec get in the way of hiring the best person.
Yeah, because sometimes you can have I'm sure we've all been there, you can have the most amazing person who matches everything on paper, and then when you bring them into the interview, it's still not the right fit. So being able to have that bit of flexibility becomes really important. Yeah. And Darla, what about from your side?
It's interesting that John mentions the spec, because one of my best interviews I ever had was my first role that I had taken when I was in the UK, and I needed to bring somebody into the business, and I had this great spec, and I'd really worked hard. It was early management days. I'm going to get the perfect spec, and I'm going to get the perfect person. And the person who turns up to the interview had none of what I needed, but they had the right attitude, right? They were eager. The questions they asked were perfect. Their interest, their excitement, and they're kind of like, I just want to do something different. I just want to learn. Is this somewhere I can learn? And I thought, this is the right fit. The spec, I can teach them how to do this, but their attitude is the right thing. And so I had a couple of other people interview them, and they had the same thing. And I was kind of worried, they're going to go, oh no, the spec is this, and we need to stay to the spec. Nope, we all agreed. Perfect person. And now I can actually say, I know where she still works, and she's a director of RA now. So, it's a perfect example. She learned, right, on the job, and she did an amazing job. So my other one was actually an internal hire. So we had an opening within the business that was coming into my team, and they came from a totally different side of the business, and they'd always done US things. And I said, well, this is a rest of the world role. How do you feel about rest of the world? Don't know much about it. Okay, do you want to learn? Absolutely. And it was that they took the time and they went away and they learned what they could and they brought it to the interview. And I thought, you know what? Let's give them a shot. Let's see how it goes, because they're the right fit and they're coming into a different team, and they also worked out really well. And it was just the good conversation, the good interest, the engagement. And I think sometimes that's priceless. Like you can't spec that away, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I would also add here that that ability to learn something becomes really, really important, because
Yes.
sometimes companies, they get so fixated on, okay, here are the 10 bullet points that this person needs to have in terms of their experience. And then, you know, they have two candidates. They have one that meets 8 out of 10 and one that meets 12 out of 10, right? And sometimes they might feel, okay, it's better to hire the 12 out of 10 because they've done the job before and, you know, like they've got more experience than what is needed. But what we've seen is that, you know, actually hiring slightly below, right, where there's growth for the individual, it leads to better retention, better engagement, and often a better outcome than hiring somebody that's almost like would see this as a step back because they've got more experience than the role requires. I don't know if either of you have seen something like that, but that's something that we see quite often here. John, you're nodding vigorously.
Yeah. I mean, like, we'd have done a lot of work, from, and this would be common, common knowledge in terms of, and it's not always kind of as clear cut as kind of typical, male versus female candidates, but I think, the Medtronic did a huge amount of work, from a diversity perspective. And what I would say there, is that generally accepted that, some of the male candidates would apply for roles when they only had 50, 60, 70% of the specifications. The female candidates typically, would have 110% before they would even consider, applying. And this would have come from some of my, female directors that worked as part of my team. And so I think it's really important, to be cognizant, of that and tease it out and encourage, to your point, Elena, encourage those folks. You don't have to be at 100%. Now, HR would probably kill me for saying that, but that's the reality. And I think also what I would say is that, your role as a hiring manager versus HR's role, they are different. HR have a role to play, you have a role to play, but ultimately you're hiring not just on your own behalf, but on behalf of your functional team. So you have a duty of care to that team in terms of, fit, and also someone with growth opportunity. So I'd agree with you, Elena. I think someone who doesn't tick all the boxes is probably, you would naturally probably lean there a little bit. That might be counterintuitive, but.
So we're just coming. This session is absolutely flying by, and we're coming just before the live Q&A. But before we go there, I would love to ask you questions about red flags. So, what are the red flags that you see in interviews? Darla, let's start with you.
Red flags. Sometimes I actually think, like, once you get people past the initial nerves part, because everyone comes in nervous and everybody has their own thing, right? Is body language can be a really clear red flag. Sometimes I find, like, if you ask a question that they're not comfortable answering, the way their body shifts, and it's kind of like they have to kind of steel themselves to answer and they get kind of rigid. And it's kind of almost like so much, they say so much of communication, like over 90% of communication is body language, right? So I always pay really close attention to body language. Are they comfortable with these questions? Are they comfortable with me, right? And then if you see that they're not comfortable with you, you try ways to be more empathetic, more understanding, trying to shift the conversation to get them more comfortable. And if that's not getting there, sometimes that is a red flag because you don't know why they're there. But, that's one that I really pay attention to. And also the other thing that I see is when they contradict themselves.
Okay.
Like they'll answer one question and they'll give you a great example of a process, and then you ask another process question and it's really similar, but it's to kind of test to see what they're going to do. And then they contradict themselves. So it's trying to understand how their mind works, right? And sometimes it's not just process, but when they contradict themselves, I think that's a pretty big red flag. And then you have to kind of take time to dig more into that with follow-up questions.
And then you need to really do active listening as well, right? To make sure that you're actually hearing what they say. Just a question on body language, though. Are there specific cues that you look out for within body language? Because that's quite a broad umbrella.
Yeah, I'd say when they get really rigid, or when they kind of, like, I've seen a lot of times when they don't know how to answer a question, or they really just have no idea, that they tend to kind of shrink. Like you see this kind of shrinking into themselves where they kind of, or like some people shrink and some people kind of, right, okay, and it's kind of, they're getting ready to pull something out of their head, and answer something that they may not actually have prepared for. So.
Very nice, very nice.
Yeah.
John, what would you say? Red flags?
Yeah. I'd agree with a number of the things that that Darla said there. They're some of the obvious ones. I'm probably always looking for. Well, maybe the first thing is kind of giving the benefit of the doubt, because I think we will see you have different personalities and characters, that are, outgoing or maybe a little bit more, reserved. So for me, and again, it's another quote I would talk about, for any movement to gain momentum, you start with a small action. So I'm always looking for the small actions or examples. Now that might, again, and maybe it's just something that I've a nuance on, but sometimes for me a red flag is when I hear about the big projects. Hey, I did, 10, 5, 10Ks. I did the first 3 PMAs for our company, etc. And often, for me, I'm often I would ask about, change orders. Tell me about, a difficult change order where, you had to make a borderline, decision on it. It could be a very simple manufacturing, change or whatever. Or give me some examples where, there's, small examples of Kaizen events or continuous improvement within your function or within your department. So for me, the flags are more so where someone is trying to overemphasize the big, high ticket, high profile projects. Whereas in actual fact, I'm probably looking for, going back to my quotation from Ger Finn, my old boss earlier, I'm looking for examples where they've outgrown their current role. Some of the smaller day-to-day, maybe mundane stuff, and doing that really, really well. So not sure if they're red flags or such, but they're definitely things that are kind of in the back of my mind as I'm in an interview process.
Mm-mm. Yeah, no, and that's really important, because it's about, like, obviously they will have prepared the really big examples and big answers, and sometimes asking for the smaller ones, and also sometimes asking the question that for sure they haven't prepared, like, so for example, the weakness question, everybody prepares that. I mean, we tell all of our candidates, make sure you've prepared the weakness question, because you're likely to be asked it, and so it's almost like you have to have an answer prepared for that one. But sometimes, there's questions that if you can be creative and come up with that, for sure they wouldn't have prepared. And it's about watching how they deal with that, that not being prepared, and actually how do they deal with being put on the spot and being uncomfortable. Can also tell you quite a lot about someone. So talking about being uncomfortable, we are going to go into the live Q&A session now. So I'm just going to take a second to share on my screen the QR code for the Slido. So if you have only just recently joined the session and you didn't see my intro, we're going to be going now into a live Q&A. So if you scan this QR code, it's going to bring up a list of questions that have been pre-registered and have been asked whilst we've been speaking on this session today. And you have the opportunity to either ask your own question, which we will try to get through as many as we can. So we're going to go as fast as quickly through these questions. But you also, if you've got nothing to ask, but you just want to have a browse, give a thumbs up to the questions that you really, really like the look of, because that way we are going to start from the most popular downwards in terms of the questions in the Slido. So without further ado, I'm going to now dip into the Slido, and I can see, wow, we have one that already has 16 thumbs up. So we're going to start with that one. So this question is by Anonymous, and the questions are going to be arriving in the chat as well, if you're in the Zoom, for you to be able to read. So the question says, what are strategies to help shy or nervous candidates do their best? So if you're looking at this from a hiring manager perspective, what are the strategies that you can offer to candidates to do their best if they were going to be interviewing with you, let's say? Who wants to take that first?
Yeah, I can take that, Elena. Okay. Yeah, so I think it's a fantastic question, because that is the reality. We kind of alluded to extroverts and introverts, there earlier, and so for myself, something small at the beginning of the interview to help the interviewee relax. So that's kind of, I genuinely tend to look at the other interests, hobbies, and things first. Because a lot of the other sections are going to be the kind of the core functional things, and I think that's a great way to start, to pick out something there, whether it's a sport or a hobby or a pastime. That's one thing. People tend to suddenly the shoulders drop and they say, okay, yeah, that I can talk to this first before we get into kind of the regulatory affairs submission process, and I think another small tip or trick, and this is often done, but giving the interviewee also as early as possible, getting them to speak through their CV at a top level, and how you ask that question, is really important as well. And just say, hey, just give me sort of, some of the key areas and the areas that, that you're maybe most proud of. So they're two small things. I think Darla spoke to it earlier there. We're all looking for a conversation. So it doesn't matter whether it's an interview over Zoom, face to face, or you just meet someone for an informal chat in a coffee shop. So any of those small little tips or tricks, I think, would be helpful.
So breaking the ice and asking them to talk through their CV and focus on the stuff that they're most proud of. Yeah, that's true. That will naturally get them enthused and talking about, the stuff that they're really positive about, which should break the ice there. Really, really nice, John. Darla, what about from your side?
So I do something similar to John. Is like when I always know what the special interests and hobbies are, and when people don't put that there, sometimes I worry because I'm like, if I get someone who's shy, how do I get them out of out of their shell? And so when I do have that, I think one of the things that I do is I always start the interview with everyone because I don't know who's coming through the virtual door or the actual door, which is I just want you to know we're having an interview, but this is a conversation. Like I want to know who you are, and I know you want to get to know what we have to offer. So let's have a conversation. I don't want you to worry about structures or times or anything. Let's just have a conversation. So tell me about yourself. Walk me through your CV. Tell me, things you like to do. What and one of the questions I ask that people never see coming, but when you get people to talk about something, what are you passionate about? Tell me something you're passionate about. And you know what? You get people who are so shy that'll be like, oh, I love dogs, or, I'm passionate about being a parent, and it starts it, and you see that immediate, like they just relax, and I think it's just being about as a hiring manager, I feel like you need to be approachable. And the more approachable you are, the more the people who are nervous and shy will just kind of relax a bit.
Really nice strategies, and they're so simple, aren't they? But actually just like setting up the conversation and kind of lowering the barrier, if you like, to say, hey, like we're both human, let's have a conversation about about you, your experience, your passion, your proud moments of your career. Will get people to kind of drop their guards, and give you the opportunity as well to actually see them for who they are and what they're like. So really nice answers. Thank you both. Let's keep going. So the next question that we have here is by also anonymous. How to analyze the candidate's commitment. Hiring without commitment leads to massive loss in time and effort for small to medium level organizations. So how do you go about analysing candidates' commitment? I guess here, candidates' commitment to actually make a move to the process, to your company. Who wants to take that one, John?
Yeah, no, I can take that one. I think the reality of this is that there's no guarantees in life, and the interview process is, one of a number of, processes or tools to help you, select the right candidate. It's not possible to analyze it and come up with, definitely we can see commitment here. So I think it's just one, you can tease it out, in the interview if you have niggles or doubts about it, in terms of when you look back and you look at kind of their tenure at other companies, and maybe explore that, a little bit. And I know that reading the question as well, obviously there's massive loss in time and effort, and that's absolutely true. But likewise, I would say the inverse of that is also correct, that if you do manage to get the right candidate, the time, effort, and energy, that is spent, in the subsequent years is reduced significantly from a manager, perspective. So no right or wrong answer to that particular one. I think you can also go with your gut feel in an interview. You will get a sense. And I would also encourage it both ways, encourage the candidate to say, hey, have you spoken to other folks that work in, for example, the regulatory quality, function here, to get a sense of how we operate. It may be very different to how you operate if they came from a small, medium enterprise and they're moving to a multinational, or vice versa. So no guarantees, but I'd be interested to hear, Darla, I don't know if you have any other tips or tricks there that would help to reduce the risk of getting the wrong person.
I think I agree with you in that it's really hard to gauge sometimes, because you can ask all the right questions and then you can get to the end of the interview process and they say no, right? When you offer. But And your point, John, about looking at tenure, I think that's a great way, but I think it's also a way of like when you're in the interview process and you see maybe short tenures, ask why. You
Yeah.
know, because we're all human. It could be that they had to move because their spouse got a different job in another place, or a relative was ill, or they were ill, you know, or they, you know, took time off to have a baby. Like, you know, there's reasons why. And I think it's, you know, how long they were at somewhere doesn't mean that they're not committed to being where you are. So I think it's about, to John's point, investigating it, asking the question. And everything in life is kind of a chance in a way. So you can't actually say for sure, oh, absolutely, they're going to come and be great. I mean, anything can happen. But asking the questions and getting as much information up front is about the best you can do.
And
Yeah,
you,
and I think
go on, John.
no, sorry, Eleanor. Yeah, I was going to say as well, in different countries in the world as well, there's different, obviously, legal and HR policies, but in some countries, there's obviously like probationary periods, where both parties have an opportunity to see how this goes for 6 months, or whatever.
Yeah.
So there are different policies in different countries as well that, may be helpful or a hindrance to that. So.
Yeah, and I would add to this, right? Because this is where our role as recruiters can really, really add value. Because as a hiring manager, there are only so many questions you can ask, and there's some questions that you'd love to ask, but you probably can't, right? So, candidates will always have a really good answer for why you're considering to move, and there might be three answers, but they might only tell you two of those. But if you have a partner that is essentially kind of like mediating between you both, the candidates might feel more comfortable actually sharing that information with a third party, as opposed to sharing it directly with someone that might then be their future boss. And asking questions, because for example, like we would always ask questions around like what are your, why are you looking to move? And if anybody turns around and says my main motivator is because I want more money, my whole team will turn to that person and say, go and ask your current company for a salary increase. Have you done that or not? Because actually, if that's the main motivator, you might get your salary increase where you are. And we would encourage the person to go back and look at that internally first before considering making external moves. And so sometimes having that partnership can be really, really valuable, especially as you go through the process as well, when it comes to offer negotiation and actually knowing, okay, somebody actually going to accept an offer if we offer X or Y. Again, sometimes candidates, they don't feel comfortable sharing that information with someone who's going to be their future boss. And so having that third party can really, really help you there. So there's a shameless plug for Elemed. If you're not already working with us, you should be. But let's continue on, because I know that we had some really interesting question around AI, which I'd love to throw to Darla. So here's the question. With new AI tools, how do you ensure that you're hiring the right candidate and not only the best of the shortlisted ones based on screening programs?
I actually ask HR, right?
Okay.
I say, okay, if we're first I've asked HR, are we using them? And if they say yes, I say, do you have any that were rejected for whatever reason? And can you look at them yourself? Sometimes that doesn't go over well with HR because like, oh, you're giving me more to do. But also I know I've lost good candidates in the process because they didn't have a certain buzzword that was in an AI tool. So I think it can be helpful to help screen people out, but it also screens out really good people, and so I ask sometimes, especially if we're not getting the caliber of CV that I want or the caliber of person that I want, I ask HR, can you please go back and look and see at the things that were screened out by the program? Just take a quick look. And if you don't want to look, send them to me and I'll look, right?
Yeah. Really good point. Really good point. John, do you have anything to add to that one?
No, it's interesting actually that came up because Darla and I had a good conversation about this in advance of in advance of today's event, and I agree completely with what Darla said. I think we've all experienced situations where, particularly for certain functions where the functions is in high demand, the last thing you want as a hiring manager is that somebody gets inadvertently screened out. So I think every hiring manager, particularly in functions like regulatory, where I come from, will do exactly what Darla have done there and say, are you sure? Let me take a second look there. So I think that's good advice from Darla.
Mm-hmm. So let's move on then, because we've got loads of questions in the Slido that I want to get through. The next one is, how do you prepare effectively for an interview? John, why don't you start us with that one?
Yeah, so that's obviously it's a big question, and my thoughts on that are couple of things. One is, be yourself, but be prepared. And that's the first thing I would say, so you don't have to over prepare. You need to have enough knowledge of the company, enough diligence done on the function to show that you're interested. And that goes back to my earlier comment about the small stuff does matter. So that preparation is important so that you're not asking maybe what might be considered to be, silly or small questions, during the interview. I would also say that all of us have been in a situation where there's a job that we really, really wanted.
Mm.
And in those circumstances, you leave no stone unturned in your preparation. So sometimes, and we're all guilty of this, you may go into an interview process where you're kind of thinking about it or you're teasing it out or whatever. But what I would say, if that job is for you and you genuinely believe that's where you want to go to, I would say leave no stone unturned. And that means talking to other people in that organization, understanding the products and portfolio, understanding the culture of that organization, and will you be a good fit? Will you, do you genuinely believe yourself you're going to be a good fit there? So it's that holistic, preparation. It could be different from job to job. It could be speaking to someone who's there. It could be, research on the internet. It could be looking at products. But yeah, there are a few thoughts that will come to mind early, Elena.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Darla, as a hiring manager, do you have maybe a couple of points what we can do to prepare?
Yeah, I think definitely look over the job spec before you go into the interview, right? And definitely like think about what it is they're looking for, and don't be afraid to say, like, this is one thing that I like, I don't know if others do, is, I don't meet this particular part of the job spec, but what I could bring to this is, and be prepared to speak to that. Like, even just put it out on the table. Because, again, John and I are similar. We're not actually going completely off the spec, but just being completely honest of where you don't meet something, but where you're willing to try and learn.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I really like what John said around speaking to other people in the organization. If you really want this, speak to people, find out what's the team like. Do you know anything about the team? Do you know anything about the hiring manager? Do you know anything about, what they do, how they work, like how they collaborate? Because I think it's good to know that going in, because it gives you an idea of kind of what you're going into. And also, I hate to say it, LinkedIn, stalk them. I hate that, sounds horrible, but like, go and look at their LinkedIn page, the hiring manager's LinkedIn page that you're interviewing with, and see like what they've done and where they're coming from. Get a feel for who they are, because it might actually help bring your nerves down as well. Because you're going, oh, okay, they are just another human like me. And it doesn't become this like scary nebulous thing in your head of just a person with a name that you don't know who they are. Put a face to a name.
But
Understand what they've done.
You make a really, really good point, which is, and I don't know if everybody's thought about this, but it's something that we talk a lot about. As a hiring manager, when was the last time you updated your LinkedIn? And like, are you realizing, especially in today's world, that every single person that you're going to be interviewing with before going to interview with you is going to be checking out your LinkedIn profile. So what does it say? Is it conveying the message that you want it to convey about you, your career history, and who you are? Because nowadays LinkedIn is a must, right? And so even if you're not looking for a job, historically it used to be, okay, get on LinkedIn if you're looking for a job, but it's not that anymore. So you'll find that candidates have like brilliant profiles. They update their LinkedIn when they're looking for a job and they make it all nice and shiny. But hiring managers, they're not always doing it. And often, you might find a hiring manager who, like literally has like no LinkedIn presence, or just like one company with like no detail at all. And think about, is that what you want prospective candidates to be seeing? And even if you don't have anything on your profile, what does that also say about you? Because that also says something. So be in control of what your professional brand looks like, whether you're a candidate or whether you're a hiring manager. Let's keep going, guys, because we've got some really good questions here. So the next one, there's quite a lot to unpack. So how important are face-to-face interviews versus remote video and using psychometric tests plus other tools for decision making? So there's a lot in there. So let's just start with your thoughts on face-to-face interviews versus remote, and then we'll talk about what tools there are to help evaluate candidates. So let's talk about remote versus face-to-face. Darla, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's a tough one, because I personally worked remotely for 14 years. So
Okay.
I'm like used to being across a video. But I think sometimes it's important, like if you start remote, to try and maybe have a face-to-face interview if you can, because I think it's a good time or a good chance, especially if you have somebody in the final stages, to introduce them to the broader team, to walk them around if they're going to be on site, to walk them around, get them to know people. I know that's harder if you're hiring globally, which I've had to do quite a lot. But I think video can work if it needs to work, right? I've hired a lot of times in India, China, Mexico, Japan, where the only option was to interview over video, right? And so I think when it's over video, you have to go a little bit extra mile. You need to make sure you keep enough time scheduled aside. You need to keep the conversation moving, and you need to try and make sure you have your video on. Do you know how many times I've done this and the candidate on the other side has not turned their video on?
Wow. Wow.
As a
Yes.
hiring manager, have your video on. I've also seen that as well. So
Yes. Yes. Or if video is not on, there's nothing more awkward than one person having their video on and the other person not having it on.
right. Yeah.
So set to your point earlier, you need to, as a hiring manager, like when you go into that interview, you need to set it up as you know, this is how long it's going to last. This is what we're going to cover. And by the way, you know, like we don't need cameras on for this. If you're not having your camera on, don't expect that candidate will, because it's really daunting for a candidate to be just looking at themselves on camera and just like the hiring manager's name. But equally, if you've got a candidate that hasn't got their video on and there is an expectation that this is a video interview, you know, don't run the whole interview with them having their video off without addressing it, but actually just let them know, because sometimes it's a technical issue. Sometimes they think they've got it on, but they haven't. So call it out at the beginning. John, what would you say?
Yeah, I think that I think there's a practical element to this. So I'd agree with Darla insofar as, you know, the reality, you know, of today's working environment, you know, between whether it's totally remote, whether it's hybrid, or whether it's face to face, that there's always going to be, you know, some degree and a large degree of video interaction. So I think that, you know, from a practical perspective, I think that would be the norm now. But preference, and this probably goes to the number of years I'm in the industry, I love the face-to-face interaction. I think there's nothing better than getting to really know a person, and maybe to Darla's point, you know, at least at the outset, to try and get a sense of the individual. So my preference always be if I can do it face-to-face, and even if that means the extra effort of traveling, and it might be for that third or final interview, or it might be for the first interview, you know, who knows. The other factor, maybe less of a factor, but is what's their work environment going to be? You know, so over the years, I would have hired, you know, regulatory professionals, some of which will be co-located in a manufacturing location where they're helping the operations team with changes, manufacturing process, you know, sterilization changes. And for them, the face-to-face interaction will also be their, you know, will be their modus operandi, you know. So I think it's, you know, there's kind of another little another angle on it there. But I think it's kind of on a case by case basis. Elena, I think we all have our preferences. Mine happens to be face to face, but I think you can still get a really good sense through video.
Yeah. So we've got quite a lot of questions still in the Slido, and I'm conscious of time. So let's speed up and go as quickly as we can through the next questions with a bit more of a quick fire pace. Just on psychometrics then, or tools, do either of you have any recommendations or tools that you found particularly helpful when it's come to evaluating and on psychometric, like what ones specifically would be good to know when it comes to evaluating candidates?
So I can say I've never actually worked in a business that used psychometric testing to evaluate people. Not that I can remember, at least that they were told. I know I've personally had to do them in hiring. And I can't remember which one it was, but it went on forever. It was like a 2-hour test with a person on the phone. And I know there's a name for that, but I can't remember off the top of my head.
John.
Yeah. And so as I mentioned earlier, for some companies that I worked with, we did have them. We found them excellent. Not so much in terms of, you know, just I think it was more of a fit for the role, as I would say earlier. I don't know technically which psychometric test, you know, was used, but the output of it was excellent. The kind of the brief read that it gave us on the candidate. So yeah, I'd be a fan.
Psychometric testing then. And at what stage in the process was that done? Did you use the report as a decision-making tool right at the end, or were you using it to inform the interview process?
No, it was at the end, so it might come after the first or second interview if you felt, hey, I'm really going to invest in this person, or if, like I mentioned earlier, if there needed to be a choice needed to be made, that might swing your decision one way or the other.
Really good. So, and then we've got another question around cultural. So hold on a minute, actually, cultural differences. So, what cultural differences have you noticed hiring across several countries? I'm going to give this to one person. So, who wants to take that one?
Darla, you take that one. We talked about it before.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So I think in cultural differences, like I noticed, the way you start interviews in Asia seems to be a bit more formal, and a lot more formal than you would see in like a Western country. So, the way I would start an interview with somebody like in the US or the EU would be like, oh, tell me about yourself, and and trying to rate that. Wherein I think in Asia there's an expectation, at least from my perspective, I don't know if this is totally true, but there's an expectation to be a bit more formal, and to introduce yourself, and it's introduce your title and the expectations at the beginning of the interview. That was something that I had an HR business partner walk me through in the past.
And you can lean on your HR business partners or your HR and actually ask if there's any recommended cultural norms that you should be aware of, especially if you're interviewing locally in a country that you haven't interviewed in before. That's also what they're there to help you do as HR. So it's really good to use that resource if you have it.
And it's important to be respectful of all the different cultures, right? Because what we find normal, another person from another culture may not find normal, and you may commit a horrible faux pas and not even know. So I think that's a point of like, whenever I've interviewed globally, I always ask my HR business partner, like, okay, is there anything I need to know so I don't like stick my foot in my mouth and make a fool of myself in the company? So it's good to find out.
So we have a really interesting question on the next one, which is, how do you overcome the political HR process for interviewing candidates for internal and external roles when hiring a recommended profile? John's nodding.
Yeah, there's a lot in this. So how do you overcome the political HR process for interviewing candidates for internal and external when hiring a recommended profile? So I'm not sure what they're getting at here, but I think, if it's hey, we need to work through the standard HR process, I would probably be a little bit of an outlier on that. I would let HR kind of manage the structure, agree the questions, and then I still always tend to find a way to hit on the 4 questions that I'd like to ask, which is like getting stuff done, fit, likability factor, and empathy. So I'm probably a pain in the butt for the HR partners in that regard, in that I kind of let them run, and then the questions that I ask mightn't be the 3 that I was supposed to, if we haven't got to those ones. But I'm not sure if I'm interpreting that one correctly or not, Elena. Darla, any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm interpreting it correctly, it's kind of that, how do we look at internal versus external? And do we do that thing where it's like we have a role that we want to hire an internal person for, but then we have to post it externally in order to hire that internal person? Does that make sense? And it has to be open for like a little bit of time. I do not have anything that I can recommend for getting around that, because sometimes that is very set in stone. That is the policy. The only thing I can recommend is I once had an HR partner say, well, we'll advertise it externally for 24 hours and pull it. Right.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you get people who apply, and if they're good, you interview them, right? I mean, you have to keep things fair and equitable. But the thing is I am always very clear that with HR saying we need to make it clear that we're considering an internal candidate, because I don't want the external candidate to feel like we're wasting their time. So I think it's also about communication to candidates, right? We have to be as fair as possible, and also let the internal candidate know we can't say that this is definitely yours. Like, we want to consider you for this role, but this is the process, and just be transparent to everybody involved.
Yeah. And to add to that from a recruitment perspective, like we always recommend to the companies that we support, we always ask them, have you looked internally first? Because there's nothing more frustrating for external candidates than going through a 5-stage interview process, going through psychometric testing, doing all of that, meeting all the different business partners, jumping through all the hoops, and then right at the end, the role being given to an internal candidate that would have been there, from the beginning. And also hiring internally is great career progression. It's great retention tool.
Yeah.
Companies should always be looking at that as their first option. Do we have anybody internally that we can actually move into this role? And it might then open up a backfill opportunity for you to look externally. But we always recommend look internally first. And when you come to us, you should be coming to say, like, we've looked internally, we don't have anyone that can do this job. We need to go externally. And that way you can run a really efficient process that has a really good candidate experience. That's really, that's the best use of everybody's time, hiring manager, as well as the business partners that you're going to involve, as well as the external candidates. And then you can make hopefully a good decision between, two candidates that you'd love to hire, as John said, and have a really positive outcome. So that would be our recommendation, to not actually play the political game and actually be really straightforward when it comes to navigating that. Okay, I'm going to just share again the QR code because we are in, guys, can you believe it? We're in the last 15 minutes of the session. This has absolutely flown by. Scan this QR code, bring up Slido on your screens and have a look at all the questions that are left and give a thumbs up to the ones you want us to answer, because we're not going to be able to get through all of them. There are so many here, but they're all super, super interesting. So if you haven't already opened up Slido, open up Slido now. We've got 15 minutes. We're going to go through as many questions as we can. Give a thumbs up to the ones you like. If there's anything burning that we haven't asked, put it in there, and let's keep going with the last few questions. So we have a question here, which is a candidate's popularity or activity on LinkedIn important for the hiring process? What would you say to that?
So by popularity and activity, I guess that means how much they post or how many likes they get, I'm assuming.
Followers they might have, yeah.
Yeah. I can personally say I've never considered that. I didn't. I consider them based on how they turn up to the interview, more than what they post on social media or LinkedIn, I guess, unless they're posting something inflammatory on social media that I find out about. But yeah.
Yeah. No, I'd agree. I don't. It's barely a factor, But again, maybe unless there's something specific in a particular role, that they were involved with an industry association or an advocacy group or whatever, and you may want to just do a quick sanity check, on that. But yeah, again, it's not something that would even enter my mind in terms of as an interviewer.
What about, I'm going to just play devil's advocate. What about if you were recruiting in a very special area, like a specific region, and this particular candidate, you had one candidate who on LinkedIn posted a lot about regulatory topics in that region and was considered almost like a thought leader in that space versus somebody that didn't? Would that make any difference to you?
Maybe. But I have to admit, I'm not one that goes and looks at, I look at candidates on LinkedIn before I interview them, but I think it's about, you can be a thought leader, but sometimes that doesn't mean you can do the job.
Yes.
So I want to take them on, what they provide in the conversation I have with them personally.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's back to what you're trying to tease out. Some of the earlier questions got to it as well. An interview is just at a point in time. There's some degree of risk that you may get the wrong candidate. You're trying to kind of reduce that risk, but you're kind of looking for substance over style, ultimately, and particularly in certain functions. So yeah, I'd agree with Darla there. Probably wouldn't be huge for me, Elena.
Really, really interesting. It's going to be interesting to see if that changes as well in the future as LinkedIn becomes more popular and is growing as a tool. So next question. What is the most important question to ask in an interview that would give an idea if a candidate has the right culture fit?
Yeah, I can start there. So I think, it's an open-ended question, but I think for me, the things that would sort of enter my mind would be, tell me what you know about our company from the research that you've done. Is there someone you've spoken to that's given you a sense of who we are? Given, that I'm interested in the person versus your achievements, why you? I think that question typically always comes up towards the end of an interview process. And what you're really looking for there then really, in that is, are they the right fit? All the things we spoke about earlier, how do they get stuff done, versus how much they have told us that they get done. So I think, I think maybe getting to that point of why you, I know it's a kind of maybe a stock question, but the individual's response to that is often very telling, Elena, or it may be something that they haven't had the opportunity to answer in the interview to date. So that's just one thing. It sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. Darla?
So I do it a different way slightly, but I've actually asked the question like, describe the best work culture you've ever been in, and why was it the best? And then because sometimes then you hear what's important to them, right? Do they value collaboration? Do they value being in the spotlight? Do they value change, like the chance to lead change? And and that is so telling sometimes when you say, describe the best that you've ever been in, and why was it so important to you? And would you want to be in something like that again? And it's kind of picking out, does that describe the culture that I'm in, right? And then you can start even relaying it to them. Oh, that sounds similar to what we do here. Because, for example, we do, because you also want them to get a feel for what you do where you are. Because we have to remember, I think that's one thing people sometimes forget. We're interviewing each other, right? We're interviewing this person for the role, but they're also interviewing us to see, do I want to work for you? Do I want to work for this company? So it's kind of going, here's what our culture is by you telling me a little bit about what's important to you. And it goes back to that whole, we're all human and having empathy. Some people, a culture of flexibility is super important. And some people, a culture of speaking up is super important. So you just have to figure out where they lie and what's important to them.
I really like that question. Really nice. Right. So there's another question here that's quite interesting, and we can't really talk about, interviewing and not touch on DE&I. So I definitely want to ask this question and get your thoughts on that. How do we ensure an equitable hiring process and not allow our prior knowledge of a candidate to cloud our judgment?
It's a really good question, first of all. So I think one thing that we need to understand as interviewers, and sorry for jumping right in, John, is we need to understand what our own unconscious bias is, right? We need to understand when we respond to somebody a certain way. I think we touched on it earlier. I don't remember, Ellen, if it was you or John, around we tend to like people who are similar to us. So sometimes what I do when I'm interviewing someone is, okay, they're very different from me, but what can that bring to our organization and to my team because they're different from me? Are they going to give me a different outlook? Are they going to give me a different view? Are they going to think differently about process and fix something that maybe we're blind to, right? And I think, and if we know them from somewhere before, you can't turn that off. But you can start asking questions that maybe counteract what you think you know to see if what you think you know actually isn't true, right? So if you know that maybe they were seen as disruptive, start asking questions to see how they're collaborative and not disruptive and try and weigh it up. It's not an easy thing to do, to be honest, if you have prior knowledge.
Yeah. And I think, and there's probably two, I'd agree, Darla, there's two parts to it. Obviously the equitable hiring process, so obviously your screening process there in terms of, diversity is important. But the one on prior knowledge of a candidate, the reality is we all have our unconscious biases and it probably does cloud, our judgment. So I think, what do you do there? So for me, it would be diversifying out in terms of the interviewer panel. So that's where the other cross-functional partners asking the questions would be important earlier, or sorry, would be important as well in getting their perspectives and then stress testing versus, your own biased view. That for me is one. And then also layers within the organization, so sometimes within your organization. I saw a question maybe there on Slido earlier, which alluded to different layers. Your manager might want to hire somebody, and the team, may not. So I think that's a really important, in terms of decision rights. So if you're the hiring manager, with your HR partner and with your own boss, it's basically agreeing those decision rights ahead of time. If you and your team feel this is really the right person, then, I think having that agreed in advance, then regardless of what your boss thinks coming in maybe late in the process, you've already agreed the decision rights process. So they're two small things, Elena, that might help.
Yeah, and you've taken the last question that I was going to ask, which is exactly that question that we saw in the Slido, which I thought was really interesting, which was around, if you want to hire a candidate, but actually your boss doesn't, or the team doesn't, do you have any advice to that? So we've already got your feedback on that, John. Darla, any final comments?
Yeah, I think if there's an objection, you have to understand why. Because I know sometimes people just go, oh no, and they don't really want to offer something. And you need to sit down and have a conversation. Like, what are the objections? And what could I recommend to you to overcome that objection? Like, is that something that is surmountable or insurmountable? Because if it's surmountable, let's look at it in a different light. If it's insurmountable, let's talk about why, right? Sometimes you're not going to win, right? But if you don't want to think about it, win or lose, but right, sometimes you're not going to get what you want. But I think because what John was saying about the layering and kind of different people looking at different things, it helps bring kind of a more complete picture. So it could be that somebody's noticed a red flag that you didn't. And that can be really valuable, and it could actually help prevent something that isn't going to work. So you can overcome objections, but sometimes maybe those objections aren't meant to be overcome as well.
Really valid point. Really valid point. Well, look, guys, this has been a fantastic session. Digging deeper into everything around interviews. So we've spoken about how to set up interviews, what the processes should look like. We've spoken about red flags. We've spoken about technology. We've spoken about good questions to ask. There was so much information in this session. So to let you all know, it is being recorded. It will be available. So you can stop, you can forward, you can rewind, you can go back and scribble down all those brilliant questions that you heard our panelists share. But now I'd like to hand over to everybody who has joined the session. And in the Slido, we're going to be launching a poll. And I'd love to know, what has been your biggest takeaway from today's session? Please let us know. Please write on Slido and let us know what your biggest takeaway or has been from today's session. I'll give you a few seconds to just share your learnings. So what have we got? Small things matter. Really good. Empathy's come up a lot of times today, which is really, really important, because ultimately we're all human. Cultural fit, asking open questions, really, really important. Very good. So we've got some key learnings in there. So I'm really glad that you've been able to take away loads of tidbits from today's conversation. I'd love to know as well, we've got another question dropping in the poll. Will you be attending the next session, yes or no? That should be launching any second now. Keep an eye on your Slido for the next question to launch. Will you be attending the next session? I would love to know if you've learned something. So far I can just see yeses on my screen, which is positive. So we're going to keep doing these sessions as long as you're all getting value from them. So please keep an eye. Just before I tell you about the next session, you will have seen that Elemed has launched our new salary report. And I know this is always really, really hot, and everybody loves to get an inkling of where they are compared to the market rate. But also, if you're hiring, this is a great tool. This gives you specific data on those functions, which your HR business partners might not have. So please feel free to scan this QR code, download the report, use it as own market intelligence for yourself, but also share it within your organization to help understand how you benchmark across the industry. And here on this QR code, you will be able to access all the other Future Leader sessions. So as I said, today was session 8. So there's 7 sessions that you can access, and you can watch on demand. You can also listen to it. If you are big on podcasts, you can listen to the episodes on our Career Diaries by Elemed podcast. You can watch them also and access them on YouTube. And we also generate written follow-ups with written summaries. So you can digest this in any form that is valuable to you. And I'm really pleased to say that we are going strong into 2025 with another episode of Future Leader Sessions. And that one is going to be focused on leading across cultural boundaries. So mark your diary for the 23rd of January, 2025. We will be back strong with episode 9 of Future Leader Sessions. But that is everything for today. So I will wish you all a really strong finish to the year. And it's maybe probably a little bit too early to say happy holidays, but I hope you all have a great end to the year. And I want to thank you both, John and Darla, for your amazing insights, and thank you for joining us on today's session. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.